up here on the front tables. There's two different things. There's a draft charter amendment and there's a draft ordinance.
Can we call to order? Okay.
I think we just heard the chair call the meeting to order.
No, I'll call it to order.
Oh, you did. Oh.
I'd like to call the meeting of the Special Ordinance Committee meeting of the 10th of March to order on the Alternative Building Heights Charter Amendment. The city attorney is passing around hard copies of some of the material for today, so please get a copy and please submit your speaker's card if you wish to speak during public comment. Last week I said that bargaining with folks is like bargaining with Darth Vader, and this week I apparently have the voice of Darth Vader, so I apologize in advance for any difficulties understanding me. Staff, we went through much of this last week. What would you like to finish up on today?
Thank you, Chair Williams and members of the Ordinance Committee. I have on the overhead a list of summary bullets from your last discussion, and the Ordinance Committee did provide quite a bit of direction on the overall approach and substance for an alternative charter amendment in terms of forwarding your recommendation to the City Council. This matter is scheduled for a City Council consideration on March 24th. At the conclusion of the meeting last week, again, even though there was quite a bit of good discussion and direction, it was suggested that we meet again this week to just further review some of the materials that staff will be presenting to the Council on the March 24th meeting. So first off, just running through these 9 points quickly, the first area, or more broad encompassing question which you discussed, was the approach, an alternative charter amendment or a supplemental amendment to the Save El Pueblo Viejo initiative that will be on the charter. The interest on the committee was 2-0 to pursue the alternative amendment. The chair, Das Williams, you had expressed initial interest in the supplement but decided to forward the alternative as an approach. I believe certainly when the matter's at the council on the 24th, that key question might still be there. The next question was to look at a consistent lowering of building heights with the Save El Pueblo Viejo. The committee 2-0 expressed going with the 40 foot in El Pueblo Viejo, 45 feet in all other areas that currently allow 60 feet in height. And I will note that committee member Francisco said early on that he would be mostly listening and not weighing in an opinion on each of these matters because of his general position not to pursue a charter amendment, either alternative or supplement. Point number 3 was that, again, the 2-0 House and Williams interested in pursuing exceptions to allow up to 60 feet for community priority projects using the existing definition of community priority projects that appears in both the charter and presently and in the zoning ordinance. In terms of another qualifying type of project, the committee 2-0 felt that a project with at least 30% of its units affordable to middle income or lower incomes as defined in the city's affordable housing policies and procedures handbook was appropriate. I think this was envisioned for the ownership projects. We also discussed residential projects in general and whether or not there should be a minimum unit size in the project to possibly qualify. I think the feeling here is that we're really looking for substantial housing projects that really help the city's affordable housing and workforce housing concerns, and that there really isn't an interest in just seeing one large penthouse and one small condo. I think we can certainly get that message out to the community that we're looking for projects that would possibly qualify for this designation to have meaningful housing components, and we talked about including that within the findings, but rather than set a minimum unit size, the desire of the committee was to leave it unspecified. That way certain opportunities would not be missed, because in some instances every additional affordable housing unit could be a benefit. Then on the rental units, there wasn't that much discussion on this point. It came up a bit late, and I can tell you that from staff standpoint, we'd like to discuss this one with you some more today. And I asked Stephen Falstich to be here from the city's housing programs. The committee said, oh, let's have rental projects meet the same standard that we're looking at for the ownership projects, which was a minimum of 30% of the units at middle income. We'd like to discuss this with you today because, again, under the city's affordable housing programs and policies, the only levels of income targeting that is recognized by the city for affordable rental is very low and low income. In fact, we've had some discussions with property owners and developers about whether or not moderate income restrictions made sense in terms of rental projects. And so really, I think the question on whether or not rental projects would have any affordability restrictions at all, or should it be an open market type project, still seeing that as a benefit, or asking you to consider what the city more traditionally would consider as affordable rental is something we'd like to discuss today. 30% affordable to middle income for a rental project just at present doesn't equate for us, so we'd like to discuss that. Then there was also discussion about mixed-use projects. Again, the anticipation is that throughout these commercial areas, it would be likely that a project would be mixed use and wanting to provide either a minimum of 30% affordable rental or housing or for ownership on top of an office building or a retail building. So I think the committee and the council want to allow for mixed use projects. There was a decision, again, not to necessarily come up with today in a vacuum an arbitrary size requirement, but to deal with it again in a procedural way when the projects are being subject to review. And on that point on process, the staff had recommended last time, and the committee agreed that the process would include having early input from the design review board, either the HLC or the ABR, on this question of site appropriateness for looking at additional height, just as a very early read before the project would come to the council for its preliminary determination. Then the project would continue and process through its normal process, and during that project development we would be looking for support of findings with exemplary architecture, substantial open space, how they treated the new variable front yard setback, and other design issues. So that is the summary of what we talked about last week. The city attorney, Steve Wiley, has prepared additional materials that help us see more clearly where this all could be going in both a charter amendment section for your review, as well as an ordinance that starts to lay out the procedural elements. And I believe he would like to discuss that with the committee. And again, when we get the opportunity to hear from Mr. Falstich, that would be helpful.
Before we do that, could we just go over the summary and make sure everyone agrees on that?
Sure. Back to the summary then. Thank you.
Since we were talking about the findings and the process of going to HLC or to ABR beforehand, as I read the staff report, the idea was it would go to that design review body first to determine whether the criteria of the amendment applied to that project and whether it would be able to receive the additional height. Is that essentially what the recommendation of staff is?
Well, not exactly. I think the criteria is a little bit more of a land use planning matter than a design review matter. So let's envision ourselves someday in the future, and we've prepared a council report for a preliminary determination on building height. The planning staff report would contain our our assessment of the applicant's proposed community priority land use, the amount of affordability, that they've met with the affordable housing staff and they understand the restrictions, and we would do the math on the numbers and all that sort of thing. So HLC, for example, it's not likely that they're going to weigh in and say, this is the right affordable housing project. I think our thought with having the HLC or the ABR weigh in early on this was because some sites are also more suitable in terms of their setting with other large buildings, proximity to historic resources, or other physical site and design planning issues that you would also like to know very early before granting the preliminary determination. And that was at least my understanding of getting that early reading, so that an applicant would have an idea of what's entailed in the whole process, both the land use and whether or not we think there'll be potential to make these findings. Very, very early on, I don't think the project's going to be very well completely designed by any means. So it'll be more of a estimation of whether or not the site and area is conducive to a larger or taller building.
And what happens if HLC or APR can foresee that it's not going to meet that criteria? Is that then will they say that to council and we make the final determination?
That's what I would imagine. Staff, again, would be, Mr. Wiley wants to weigh in on this, but for your preliminary determination, the way it works now is an applicant for a community priority can come to you for preliminary allocation, and you can decline to grant that at the preliminary stage. So if the project was a museum and had 40% affordable condominium units, we as staff would say it meets the preliminary criteria, but we have this other criteria, and we think that you would also want to consider what HLC or ABR thinks about its likelihood of being a feasible and appropriate project. Mr. Wiley.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think this is an important point, and I think what staff is suggesting is has large elements of trying to be practical about this in terms of what an applicant really how they might need this to work in order for it to really work in practice. In other words, it's such a fundamental decision about a project. Can this project be, let's say, 50 to 55 feet tall and possibly 3 or 4 stories? Or must it be 3 or less or fewer stories and not exceed 40 feet? And that you can see that's so fundamental. It's like, well, what do I ask my architect to do? So then on the other hand, the council's going to be asked, and what we're suggesting is primarily, at least what I'm suggesting, is a council level decision, both preliminarily and ultimately, because, and that's why I was not at all suggesting that the design review boards weigh in on these community priority criteria. Because generally we have not communicated to design review boards that land use considerations are something they're supposed to be weighing in on. That's more for the Planning Commission and the City Council. But anyway, that we have this fundamental question, but the council, and so it needs to start at the council level as we see it, at least preliminarily, but then the council just, actually in our experience, the council will say, what is this going to look like? We haven't had any kind of design review, and that aspect, the appearance of this project is so critical in terms of us deciding whether this is actually a community priority or not, or the type of affordable project, mixed-use affordable project potentially, that we would like to see, that I think it would be only a natural tendency for the council to resist making a preliminary determination and say, we've got to have some design review, at least conceptual. So that's why this process has conceptual design review, and the applicant, can be real clear with, let's say, ABR. We are going to design to 50 to 55 feet, and we will be asking the council for a preliminary designation under Charter Section 1506. So that's our design, but we want your concept input. then the applicant can take that concept input and ask their architect potentially to refine the design before it goes to the city council for a preliminary designation. At that point, an applicant knows, I should be okay. I've got the general design and I've got a preliminary indication from the city council that they're on board with this project. At that point, we're suggesting then it go to the planning commission and then it finalize its design review, knowing that ultimately they need to get a final designation under Charter Section 1506 from the City Council in order to pull permits. And we need to talk about that final designation, and I think it might work as we go through the implementing ordinance.
Two other questions. One is that I don't remember permit exceptions up to 60 feet. I remember that we were lowering both to 40 and 55, but I don't know if that's something that you recall. I have a strong feeling that what the voters are asking for is something that's a reduction over what we have, but something in my mind that still allows for community priorities, affordable housing. And what I mean by community priority is not-for-profit entities, which is what's in the code. So is that something that we can revisit or button down? Because as the staff recommendation was 45 and 60, I thought we reduced that by 5 feet, but I thought that we reduced that by 5 feet on both ends to be 40 and 55.
Well, Mr. Chair, I don't remember us going that far in our conversation. I remember that we talked about what they have here, 40 in EPV and 45 in other commercial zones, but then the range of possibility, I mean, it doesn't mean that every project comes in at 55 or 60 feet or whatever. It's just that that's the current range that we have in that area, and then it has to go through this extensive review to make sure that it fits in as appropriate. So I feel staff got it right on this from our conversation the other day anyway.
Great. Then
it's not to say every project that we're talking about comes in at 60 feet. No, that's not even at all. It comes in at whatever is necessary to make it work and be plausible to all the design review and the city council and everyone.
Let's proceed on to the city attorney's presentation. And if there's anybody who wants to do a speaker's card, they're in the back. Please turn them in.
Mr. Chair, the first document I was going to go through is a one-page proposed draft alternative charter amendment to Charter Section 1506. This would be the actual charter language. This draft shows the changes from the existing charter language, the existing 1506. And you see that first change there, 40 feet in the area designated El Pueblo Viejo Landmark District by subsection C of Charter Section 817. Maybe if I could just quickly show you a copy of Section 817. I wasn't aware of this actually until analyzing the Save El Pueblo Viejo initiative, that we had put the description, the exact boundaries of El Pueblo Viejo in the charter so that they can't actually be reduced without voter approval. And that's my point here. I bolded it. It's a little tough to read, the two sentences there. So the boundaries of El Pueblo Viejo are in the charter. This was a fairly recent charter amendment. I think it was about 10 years ago. And then the second sentence says that the boundaries may be expanded by the city council through the adoption of appropriate ordinances. So El Pueblo Viejo could only get bigger. It could not get smaller without a vote of the people. So that's the only point on that. Back to but there was never really any interaction between the height limitation in El Pueblo Viejo until the Save El Pueblo Viejo initiative proposed that. So then this, as an alternative, needs to deal, because this is suggesting as well that we go to 40 feet generally within El Pueblo Viejo. We need to refer to El Pueblo Viejo. And I suggested here that we reference the city charter section so people know if that thought occurs to them that, well, possibly the city council could change El Pueblo Viejo on its own, that really is not the case. You'll see where we've stricken the existing language that allows buildings within manufacturing, industrial manufacturing, and other commercially zoned areas to go up to 60 feet. Of course, that's our existing situation, has been since 1972. A small point here that I think we'll talk about a little bit more. You know, there's always been this interaction between the height limitation and an area's zoning, so that anything zoned industrial, manufacturing, or commercial, which is a city council decision, could go up to 60 feet. But of course, our waterfront, our coastal zone has never been zoned that way, and Outer State Street is not zoned that way. Essentially, we're talking about the central business district and then the CM-M1 areas of the city that primarily are out Haley-Gutierrez corridor. Here, though, without, I don't think most people have thought about the fact that that situation could all change with a city council ordinance. Now, that would be a supermajority type ordinance under Charter Section 1507, but theoretically the council could rezone the coastal, well, that's a bad example, rezone Upper State Street in such a way that it would allow 60 feet. So that's something I think, that's an issue that this alternative needs to deal with at some point, because we don't want, no one in any of this debate has suggested that we want to rezone Upper State or the coastal zone to allow 60 feet. And we want to be real clear that that's not what this alternative is about. We're only talking about the existing areas that could go to 60 feet and a new limitation on those areas. So then we get to the end of this proposed charter section, and essentially we're saying, notwithstanding the above, the council, through a special use permit process. Now, I want to, special use permit, there's no magic to that term. It's just, you know, I mean, it's special, you know, it's different. It's not a CUP, it's something we're creating here that's essentially going to be a council level determination. So in addition, you might be doing something that requires development plan approval. You might be doing a subdivision that requires the planning commission initially to approve a subdivision map. But if you're going to go above 40 feet in EPV or above 45 feet elsewhere, you're also going to need a special permit, special use permit issued by the city council. Again, that would be only within the industrial, manufacturing, and commercial areas that are zoned for those uses. That even though that's new language there, that's the same concept that's always been in Charter Section 1506, provided that you're designated a community priority project. And I did make a change, I should point out. The committee received a draft of this yesterday, but this draft has a change there. Yesterday's draft referred to the municipal code definition of community priority. And thinking about it, I realized if the concept here is to say we're not changing the definition from Measure E of community priority, the definition that's been used for 20 years and that's been in the charter for 20 years, we might as well put it right in here and make it clear that this is the definition from the charter. And then we move on to or community priority, or to provide residential units with at least 30% of the units permanently deed restricted for ownership or occupancy. I just would point out that ownership or occupancy gives us the flexibility in the implementing ordinance to deal with condos, ownership projects, or apartments, because they would be occupied by qualifying families. And then we're not going to really recreate the wheel when it comes to defining affordable projects. We're going to reference middle income or lesser income households as established in the city's uniform housing or affordable housing policies and procedures, a longstanding document. Finally, I point out in italics here that if this is going to be an alternative amendment on the city ballot or charter amendment on the ballot, we need to think about, well, what if both of these proposed charter amendments are approved by the voters, and what if somehow, and this really isn't on its face, that these things are not inconsistent with each other. And I will point out the California Constitution is very clear that competing initiatives, the initiative that gets the most votes is controlling. So we may not even need to say this, but I don't think it hurts to say that if this alternative were to receive more votes than the Save El Pueblo Viejo initiative, that to the extent they were inconsistent, that this one would be controlling. And as I say, that's the standard legal requirement. This would be part of the ordinance that the council would adopt in calling for the election and placing this on the ballot. If we could move on to the ordinance, the draft ordinance. This is the draft implementing ordinance that again, fundamentally, as an amendment to the city's zoning ordinance under Charter Section 1507, this could only be adopted with a supermajority of the council, could only be amended with a supermajority of the council. And that's, I think, an important point in all of this. It has been since 1507 has been on the books. We don't focus on it a lot, but that supermajority requirement is consistent with the charter. Oh, yeah. Okay, good point, yeah. Right. This first page is fairly simple. Actually, there's not much to it other than making it clear that affordable housing project is as defined in the AHP&P, except it does not include upper middle income. And you may want to go over that some more, as Ms. Weiss mentions. Mr. Falstich is here, possibly to answer any questions about that. So then, I guess we've got an issue here. As I understand it, we've got a bit of a glitch in the building height definition. And one of the things that we might want to do in this implementing ordinance is revise the building height definition. Yeah, ultimately we get to the actual substance of the building height definition at the end of this ordinance. So the next page, if you know. Okay, again, community priority project there at the top. This was revised from yesterday's draft, and that's why this is outlined. As in the as I mentioned in the charter amendment, the alternative, as long as we're using the definition of community priority right out of the charter, I just thought we should be real express about that and say as defined in the charter. And then what I've done is taken the actual text right out of Section 1508. It's actually in two different places. I might as well just show you that. This is a cut and paste of Measure E, two relevant sections from Measure E that, of course, has been on the books since November of 1989. You'll see that a community priority project are those which are found by the council as necessary to meet present or projected needs directly related to the public health, safety, or general welfare. That second sentence really isn't relevant here. Well, that's nice, but that doesn't tell you a whole lot, is it? The council knows it when it sees it, apparently. But E actually adds a bit more substance to that definition. If you look at a general welfare project, is defined as a project which has a broad public benefit, for example, museums, child care facilities, or community centers, and those are just examples, and which is not principally operated for private profit. I had not realized, and apparently there was a typo in last week's staff report, that word principally is in there. And so I made sure it was in here this time. And which is not principally operated for private profit. That's the non-profit requirement. Anyway, just to move on, the definition in the implementing ordinances is the exact wording put together correctly from Charter Section 1508. Back to this page, Section B makes it clear that you need a special permit from the City Council in order to exceed 40 feet or 45 feet height limitations within the city. Then we get into the process of conceptual design review, and it is clearly design review. The council hearing process, the public noticing, for example, there at the end of that subparagraph 2, would be as required in the state government code. That's the state planning law, the general noticing requirement. That requirement is mailed notices to all neighbors within 300 feet of a project and a published notice, let's see, not less than 10 days in a newspaper of general circulation, not less than 10 days prior to the hearing. And the city's posting regulations are the yellow-orange sign that we've moved to where the property is posted. And in accordance with our posting regulations, and I actually didn't have any detail on those, I just assume we have some regulations about how those work. Subparagraph 3 gets into the required findings. Community priority or affordable project. I think community priority speaks for itself. Affordable, again, is the 30% that we understood the committee to direct us last week. And again, it's ownership or occupancy, and again, it's middle income or less. Finding B is the exemplary architecture, and maybe the more substantive part of it is the next page, top of the next page. But, and I did see a public comment letter saying Santa Barbara always insists on exemplary architecture, and it's hard to argue with that. You know, I mean, we don't really, and as I see it, have our design review boards or planning commission, anyone saying, well, it's not exemplary, but I'll approve it anyway. We pretty much insist on that. And so in that sense, this is kind of a make-weight finding. But at the same time, findings are findings. The law requires you to have evidence to support your conclusions. And I think this is similar to the recent ordinance we did that Councilmember House referred to last week, what we called the findings ordinance. It sort of was intended to address part of the concern with taller buildings, that this apparent lack of communication between the design review boards and the planning commission and even the city council at times. If they articulate certain things about a project that maybe then that forces them, it requires them to focus on those things and to really actually ultimately in the end in making their substantive decision justify their decision. And so when we say, no, you've got to tell us that this is exemplary architecture, it really does focus that discussion. So I guess the point is that there's two sides to this argument, but there's probably no particular downside to having this as a finding here. Appropriate setbacks and open space. I will tell you that this is fairly vague. Again, it's vague because the approach here is a very subjective approach. And it says, other than identifying setback, front setback, in fact, not all setbacks, but the front setback and open space, both common and private open space, as something that is appropriate. So it calls out the concern, focuses maybe the council on the concern. In this case, this is kind of a cross between, this would be a design thing and a land use consideration. It doesn't have any real detail. It does mention that variable may be appropriate. And then in some cases, if we do get projects that are proposed as apartment units, this would simply be a finding that the units will be deed restricted to remain apartment units. I think, there is a concern under the Subdivision Map Act that someone always has the right to apply for a condominium, and that includes converting a project to condominiums. But in this case, when an applicant, a project developer, is coming to the city asking for a special consideration, in this case to exceed 40 or 45 feet, the trade-off, the quid pro quo, if you will, is a deed restriction for an apartment complex that they will not convert to condos. So I think that's probably legal under the subdivision map, not preempted under the Subdivision Map Act. There's a italic question here. I believe this was from staff about whether we would require, I'm not sure if we answered this finally last week, require an apartment project to be affordable to middle income or lesser income families.
Do you want to take a break so that Mr. Falstich can present on that issue? Mr. Falstich. It is now.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Falstich, the city's housing, affordable housing supervisor, and I wanted to respond to the language in the charter. If we could start with looking at that. What the charter language says regarding affordability, the charter amendment, is that 30% of the units would be restricted for ownership or occupancy by families qualifying as middle-income households. What I would suggest is that that language really isn't consistent with the city's current policies regarding rental housing. It is with ownership housing. When we have ownership units that are restricted either because they're subject to the city's affordability requirements under the inclusionary ordinance or because of density bonus, those ownership units are restricted to middle income. So that's exactly what this charter amendment says. For rental, any units that receive density bonus, the inclusionary does not apply to rentals, so there's not an analogy there. But for the units receiving density bonus, the city's adopted affordable housing policies and procedures require those units to be low income. And the reason for this distinction is that rental units are, by their nature, less expensive than ownership units in Santa Barbara. And we don't even have a policy called affordable beyond low income for rental units. So just as an example, I calculated what the affordability of a rental unit, what the maximum rents of an affordable unit would be if it were restricted to middle income, and that would be restricted to households, targeted to households of 120% of area median income. A two-bedroom unit would be about $1,750. Well, that's exactly what the median rent is that the staff found through a rental survey last year. So that means half of the units in the rental units in the city are already at or below that limit. So it really would raise the question as to whether those units are providing a public benefit that is, worthy of the additional height and that sort of thing. So my suggestion would be that if you were to be consistent with the city's current adopted policies and treat the public benefit similar to the public benefit that we deem necessary for granting of a density bonus, then you would amend this language to say that 30% of the residential units either have to be owned and occupied by households that are middle income or rented to low income households in accordance with the city's adopted affordable housing policies and procedures. So I know I throw these numbers out very casually, but they all do relate to specific rental levels, and I'd be happy to try to answer any more questions about that if you have them.
Mr. House, you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Fausich. So the language would be would be 30% affordable to middle income or rented out to lower than?
Well, it would be
If you'd repeat that again.
30% of the housing. I'm not going to craft
Right.
or suggest specific language, but it would be basically 30% of the units need to be affordable ownership units targeted to middle income,
Ownership.
or 30% of the units need to be affordable rental income targeted to low income.
Okay.
Rental units targeted to
Got
low
it.
income.
Okay, I got confused in there. My question for you is, in the city of Santa Barbara, in terms of development of housing stock, in particular now focusing on rentals, have we been, as a community, providing rentals housing over the past several years to keep up with demand in the middle income range?
Well, I know that there's been almost no new rental construction in larger projects for at all. So I know that the answer to that question would be no, we're not keeping up with any increased demand for market rate rental housing.
I'm thinking in terms of since I think 1986, when a tax law changed, we haven't seen any apartment houses to speak of, just maybe a couple, even on the South Coast in terms of that, and certainly nothing except for in the ones and twosies kind of in add-ons in neighborhoods that would approach the middle income need. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve if this language were to go forward. So are you suggesting that there would be no benefit to the workforce? We talk about workforce housing, for emphasizing middle-income workforce housing as a community priority?
Well, I don't. That really is a policy decision, and I don't want to intrude on your policy. I really am only meaning to point out what the current affordable housing policies and procedures say about the benefit that we require if we're going to grant a density bonus.
Right.
You could certainly amend the affordable housing policies and procedures to create a category of middle income rental housing or workforce rental housing, whatever you want to call it. Or I would suggest that if you think that there's a benefit from the additional market rate rental housing, that you not even deem it affordable. Just, you could give a benefit for the creation of rental housing. Although in the El Pueblo Viejo district, maybe those, rather than $1,750, which is the median, they might be $3,000, which wouldn't provide the benefit that So I guess what I'm saying is, you tell me what who you want to target, and I'll help you make that consistent with the city's affordable housing policies.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Falstich, one question for you. What percentage of the housing units in the city are rental units?
I believe that I'm not sure on the basis of units. Well, I think it is. Consistently, it's been about 60% of the housing units are rental units and about 40%. I think it's 58% rental, and that's been pretty consistent over the past years. Is that correct? Okay.
Okay, so what you're saying is 60% of the units, of the housing units in the city are rental units, and that somehow the market in rental units, without any help from us, has managed to be affordable to households of middle income.
I think the market is affordable to middle income as defined by our affordability criterion.
Good, thank
at
you.
least in the median range. I
Sure.
mean, there are certainly units that aren't.
Sure, thanks.
I think that's a good point. And I think one of the things that's important is that we're not going to have a whole lot of these kinds of projects in a built-out city at all anyway. And so my desire is two things: simplicity and that whatever the community benefit go, that it mostly be targeted towards middle income ownership units. And so I would suggest to the committee that we keep it on that, because we're probably not talking about a whole lot of additional projects in the city as a whole, and the need out there is for middle income ownership units.
Chair Williams, I just wanted to add a comment on this question of rental as a category for a possible special council approval. Has been discussed since it was initiated, and the comment really has ranged from those that felt any additional rental housing because of the small numbers of additional housing, rental housing projects that we've seen, as Mr. House explained, onesie, twosie. I think we came up with that term to define the small increments of additional rental housing we're seeing, other than large affordable rental housing projects that the Santa Barbara Housing Authority has done or other partners have done for rental housing. I just want to point out that in the planned Santa Barbara policy direction, there is a housing policy that would go into our housing element, similar to existing housing policy, looking for incentives for rental housing. So an incentive for rental housing generally could be thought of as increased density. That's usually what people think. An incentive for rental housing in the future might be this ability to ask the council to have a taller project than would otherwise be provided in El Pueblo Viejo, which is actually a fairly large area of the community in the downtown area, possibly limited to 40 feet. A rental project might see that as an incentive. So I just wanted to point that out.
And it's my understanding that is correct, and from what Mr. Faustich was saying, and was just reconfirmed, that is that the market is actually providing the what we would call workforce affordable, if just by the very nature of rentals. I'm concerned about that, because I just see so many people commuting into Santa Barbara that just can't find a place, and the rents seem to be going up, not holding steady. So it's a concern I have.
All right, let's return to Mr. Wiley's presentation, and then we're going to public comment soon. Right, Mr. Wiley?
Yes, I'm just about finished here. I was up to the final community priority or affordable designation by the council. As you know, the concept here is the same or similar to that we use in Measure E, and that's before you can actually pull your building permits, you have to get a final designation. So that would be true here. But the same concern arises between this. We have this all the time when we have a preliminary approval and a final approval. What's the standard of review for the reviewing body? What can, for example, the council in this case at final say, you know what, we just changed our mind and you can't exceed the height limit. And what this draft is suggesting is that really would not be appropriate. That's not how we typically do it, and ultimately that's just going to cause a lot of trouble. And once the council has granted, so essentially the preliminary designation is going to be the substantive designation. At least that's the way this draft is suggesting. If you look at that second paragraph there, it says the city council shall issue a final community priority or affordable housing designation to a project pursuant to this section when the project has obtained all of its city required land use approvals and is designed and proposed for operation in a manner which substantially conforms, the substantial conformance standard of review, which is what we use now, to the project for which a preliminary community priority or affordable housing designation was previously granted. So if they're back asking for final and they substantially conform, now that is a decision, a determination made by the city council as to whether they substantially conformed. But if they substantially conform with their preliminary approval, they're pretty much entitled to their final approval. One of the reasons that's suggested is that I'm not sure what the alternative might be, other than you've got to convince us twice, and at the second point, you've spent a lot of money getting there, time and money getting there. And I think most applicants will tell you and architects will tell you That's not very workable or fair, I think they'd say. This final, the final sentence there is the noticing requirements, and it is not the same as the original preliminary. It would only be published notice, and that's my suggestion, that to send mailed notices often conveys at final approval, conveys the wrong message. People don't understand that they really should have been at the preliminary approval, either voicing their support or their opposition. But, you know, it really is your call if you want to do mailed notices for the final approval and posting as well there. The E is that issue about that I was mentioning about the coastal zone or the upper State Street, the areas that are currently zoned at 45 feet, but that's just a zoning thing. This makes it clear that nothing in this ordinance is authorizing or endorsing and encouraging the city council to essentially upzone those areas so that they could go to 60 feet. But I have to tell you, because it's the status quo and we're pretty much sticking with the status quo, we are not in this charter amendment precluding Upper State Street from doing a 60-foot project somehow. It would take rezoning, upzoning the property, and this city does not upzone very often. But it's the status quo, and we're not. This approach is not changing the status quo. Now, I have to point out, that is different than the Save El Pueblo Viejo initiative. That initiative will move the entire city to not more than 45 feet by charter. So I just wanted to point that issue out. Finally, the administrative regulations is just generally a good idea. We never can anticipate all the details and submittal requirements, and so this authorizes the Community Development Director or Department to develop those regulations, to have them approved by the City Council. And then on the last page, we've got the building height definition in this ordinance because I think the idea, the desire is to revise that definition as part of this process. And then Section 3 of the ordinance, again, my suggestion is that this implementing ordinance actually be on the books when the election takes place this November, if this alternative is on the ballot. And so that as a result, the ballot materials will have the information about the implementing ordinance. It'll have the actual text of the implementing ordinance. But it'll be clear that this ordinance, this Section 3 makes it clear, this ordinance will not actually, while having been adopted by the City Council, and again, a 5-vote majority, while having been adopted, will not become effective unless and until the alternative amendment is approved by a majority of the voters. And in fact, it would require them more voters approving it than the Save El Pueblo Viejo initiative. So that's my presentation, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Are there any questions for Mr. Wiley before we go to public comment? Mr. House.
Mr. Wiley, one question, if might turn you to the proposed alternative charter amendment to the city charter, section 1506, the second set of underlines.
Yes.
And I think this goes a little bit to what Mr. Williams was talking about earlier, that states, notwithstanding the above, the City Council may establish by ordinance a special use permit process to allow buildings of up to, and it goes on from there. And I believe, and it's funny because as I was reading this, I realized this is something I was expecting or thinking about bringing here. To allow, if it were to be worded this way, to allow buildings of up to an additional 15 feet within those areas of the city zone for industrial manufacturing and other commercial uses. That I think goes to what you were talking about a few minutes ago, which is there is a differential between the already lower, the 40-foot area and the 45-foot area, if we word it that way. And the idea, again, permit process to allow buildings of up to an additional 15 feet in height within those areas. And I'd just like you to consider that as we Mr. Wiley, as we continue to hear from the public and discuss this.
All right, let's start with Lisa Plowman, followed by Alex Peugeot. I'm going to time limit it 2 minutes because that's what we have time for today.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thanks for allowing us to speak again. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and SB for All, and I just wanted to take a minute to sort of remind everybody who SB for All is. We're a group of varied, concerned citizens that are in all kinds of industries and businesses who volunteer our time because we care about the community and we care about its future. There are a lot of groups that have expressed support for SB for All's efforts, and I just want to list who they are really quickly. Sierra Club, SB Can, Community Environmental Council, the Sustainability Project, Pueblo, the AIA, the local chapter of the APA, and there are a few others as well. I won't go on and list them. I have a few focused comments just on the amendments that we've talked about today and that you commented on last week. With respect to the definition of community priority, we support Measure E's definition. We do not support the preliminary review by HLC and ABR, primarily because of what Ms. Weiss described. This is really a land use question, not so much a design question, and I think that the current design process actually provides more than sufficient analysis of the design, and there is a lot of effort and time taken by these bodies to make sure that these projects are consistent with the current design guidelines that are already in place at the city. And I actually think it would be an interesting project for every council member to try and take a project through the HLC or the ABR and experience what that process is like, because they're very thorough. With respect to affordable housing, we believe that we need both middle and upper middle income, not just middle. That caps it at people making 160% of the area median income, and the people that are making between 160 and 200 are often those that leave our community and commute in. So we think it's really important to allow that higher level that's already acknowledged in your affordable housing policies. It's not necessarily part of the inclusionary program, but it is a category that is acknowledged. With respect to rental housing, we believe that rental housing is important both for low income and for middle income and for upper middle income, and we would encourage you to create an exception for all types of rental housing in this ordinance. Quickly, just on ratio of uses, we just wanted to make sure that it's flexible enough in the ordinance so that in the event La Cumbre Plaza wanted to have additional units above, or Paseo Nuevo, there was going to be an effort to maybe build some housing above that they could do it, so that the ratio of commercial to residential was not overly strict to prevent that kind of change. With respect to substantial open space, I thought the findings were sufficient in what Mr. Wiley presented, but I think we have to be really careful here. There's been some efforts about expanding the amount of open space that would be required for these projects that get the exception. And I've said this before in a meeting at the Planning Commission, but here we are granting this exception and an incentive to go to build these affordable units or this community priority by going up. And then we're taking it away by requiring this added density by requiring additional open space beyond what's currently required. So you just have to be careful on how you craft this thing so that you don't sort of cut your own legs out from under you when we're trying to create this incentive for these community priorities. We're supportive of the 5-foot variable setback along the front, and we think that if the objective of this additional open space being required is to ensure that the public has some relief because these buildings are taller, that's what the area that should take care of it is at the front, not this question about private open space. So if you have these variable setbacks along the front of the project with landscaping, that would be your additional open space. Quality of architecture. And I think Mr. Wiley may have been referencing our letter with respect to whether or not we should have an additional finding, but I'm not really sure how you measure exemplary architecture. And I think it even creates more difficulty once you get down to the commission's level about how to answer that question. You already have pretty thorough and strict design guidelines that we think are sufficient, and that the design review process is already doing a very fine job. And I think we see that as we look outside at the buildings that have been built. And then with respect to height limits, we've supported a 45-foot height limit as an alternative. But we have, because we think this will allow for well-designed 3-story buildings with sloped red tile roofs. But if it's the council's objective to have a 40-foot height limit, with a change in the building definition to allow these sloped roofs, we think we could support something like that. But we want to make sure that the change in the building definition is really clear in whatever ordinance gets put forward to the people, so that they understand what they would be voting for or not voting for. And then lastly, I just wanted to make a comment about this question about whether or not the maximum should be 60 feet. And I think we're worrying a little bit about something that doesn't exist. You don't build a building to 60 feet in this town. If you've noticed that around, that just doesn't happen through the ABR and the HLC. And so even further pushing it down results in a further reduction. So I think it's not necessarily something we need to address. It's kind of like a problem we don't need to fix. So with that, I will close my testimony and am available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I was nice to Lisa because I was nice to Connie last time, but we need to keep to 2 minutes. Alex, followed
Mr. Godfather, I will not take that long.
Maybe.
Consigliere, I'd like to put my 2 cents on behalf of mixed-use buildings, because in this process, and mixed-use zones and mixed-use buildings, because in this process, sometimes I see people that don't really seem to appreciate them, and all of a sudden it has become like a target of projects. The terms public safety and general welfare are used a lot in the zoning, in zoning circles and in ordinances, but there's nothing more pertinent to this, to safety and health, than mixed use. Since Jane Jacobs wrote this in 1961, right? Eyes on the street. The idea of having shops, having people living upstairs, and putting eyes on the street. As we, as the city, wrestles with an epidemic of violence and gang violence in the streets. Think about this, because this relates to that as well. I agree with the comments that Lisa Plowman made on behalf of Santa Barbara for All. I'd like to emphasize the item of workforce housing. Make sure that does happen. And 60 feet. Sometimes I dream about having some housing units on top of Paseo Nuevo. And what if, well, gee, maybe the 60 feet, if you go to 55, maybe something cannot happen. It's just an opportunity, not that it will be used all the time. And then we go back to the 40 feet. I talked to you about that last time. 3 stories with a sloped roof apparently cannot be done within 40 feet. I mean, this is an item of discussion, but you may go to an item that we are discussing right now on the Landmarks Commission, a 3-story building with a sloping roof, that it comes at 46 feet because the site slopes. So you need to address that, because I don't think you want a 2-story downtown. Thank you.
Debbie Cox Bolton, followed by Deddy Piker.
Chair, committee members, my name is Debbie Cox Bolton. I'm the executive director of the Coastal Housing Coalition, and we represent thousands of local workers here on the South Coast. We've spoken before about this issue as it's gone through the process, and I first just want to say that we're disappointed that we're having this conversation outside the Plan Santa Barbara process that was set up to have this kind of comprehensive look at development and growth over that will affect our future. But we are where we are, and because this issue is going to be on the November ballot, we just have come here to support your efforts to put an alternative charter ballot measure on the ballot in November. You've heard in poll after poll and through the Plan Santa Barbara process that this community feels strongly that providing housing for all kinds of income levels is a priority. And for that reason, we feel that you're taking a very rational and reasonable approach to try to marry 2 public sentiments that you're hearing and putting an alternative that looks at lowering building heights but yet makes exceptions for community project priority projects, including affordable housing. I did want to just mention a couple points about the language in the amendment. First, we strongly urge you to, as past speakers have said, to consider including the upper middle income bracket in these projects. Up to 200% of area median income. To put a face on that, a quick search on current job openings, you're talking about a entry-level police officer married to a public health nurse that makes 200% of area median income. And I think that's exactly the kind of people that there's consensus in the community that we want to help try to live near their jobs and not have to commute to buy a home in Ventura or Lompoc. And finally, just another point for your consideration, it seems like a lot of thought has been given, so momentum is growing behind this concept of affordable by design, that by building smaller unit sizes, perhaps we can bring down prices of homes. And it just seems a little inconsistent that there's no discussion of that piece in this ordinance or in this amendment. You know, whether or not there's some way to try to incentivize that kind of building by giving more height to people who design that way. But anyway, just that for your consideration, something that seems to be missing from this discussion. But with that, thanks for hearing us.
Diddy Pikert, followed by Joe Androlitis.
Good afternoon, Chair Williams, committee members. I'll keep since the other speakers have really touched on all the specific issues, I want to keep my comments somewhat more general and brief. But mainly the fact that it's become obvious over the last few months that the SEPV Building Height Charter Amendment ballot measure is seriously flawed because it doesn't address a lot of the issues critical to the future of our community. It's not had the benefit of any really informed community debate or any kind of analysis on the potential unintended consequences. So as our city leaders, we look to you to make sure that the interests of all our citizens are considered and all the issues properly debated as we make these important decisions affecting the long-term future of Santa Barbara. And I'm here today because I'm convinced, as many, many other members of our community are, that we need to provide an alternative ballot measure that addresses those concerns that we have about the future development of the city, while at the same time addressing the critical needs we have for workforce housing, community priorities, and particularly the need to make sure that we can continue to move our city in the direction of becoming a sustainable community and addressing the bigger picture environmental issues as well, global warming and peak oil, etc. So therefore, I just urge you to continue to work in crafting this alternative ballot measure, particularly in the manner that was outlined in the letter from Santa Barbara for All and the presentation that Lisa made. I think it's very, very important that people have a real choice in the November election. And just the final point is that the issue of the building height, the 45 feet versus the 40 feet, I think is really important. Just from personal experience, I believe that to design a well-designed building in under 40 feet that provides the kind of spaces that really make for a proper and well-designed building, and sort of the kind of roof modulation that we expect in the architecture here in Santa Barbara, we really need to either allow for the 45 feet under the current height definition, or if 40 feet is going to be adopted, there needs to be another definition that will allow for the sloping roofs, tile roofs, et cetera, that we expect. Thank you.
Joe Androlitis, followed by Michael Holliday.
Good afternoon. My name is Joe Androlitis, past president AIA and current chair of the Committee on the Environment for local AIA chapter. I'll be really brief. I'll give the rest of my time to Lisa, who already spoke since she went over. I'm disappointed to be here and talking about this because I'd rather be focusing on making our city more sustainable. But obviously, you have to address the impact of the ballot initiative that's currently before us. When I look at this whole process of what we're doing here, it seems kind of backwards to me because these are the types of projects we want in Santa Barbara, and we're making it seem very difficult to get there. So I just offer that maybe if we can look at a scenario where when we get the right project, we actually make it easier for those types of projects to get approved. I mean, if we had the dream project, 100% affordable, LEED Platinum, do we really need to make them go through all these hoops and hurdles to get there? Isn't that what Santa Barbara wants? I've been to many workshops and planned Santa Barbara meetings, and that's what people talk about. So maybe we can look at making it a little easier. So thank you.
Michael Holliday, followed by Connie Hanna.
Mr. Chair, member of the Ordinance Committee, my name is Michael Holliday. I'm a local architect. I'm also a board member with the U.S. Green Building Council, the Santa Barbara chapter. I'm the Government Relations Chair for the AIA, a member of the Santa Barbara Contractors Association, and a board member with the Chamber of Commerce. All four of our organizations have written letters opposing any height reduction ordinance in the city for reasons that have been stated. We just don't think it's necessary. Also, I think many of the facts that were put out by El Pueblo Viejo have admittedly been misleading at best, and they did not anticipate any economic downturn. If you looked at those charts and graphs that were presented, everything was going to be built this year. Well, a lot of things are different from 6 months ago or a year. But more importantly, I think what we're interested in is that the residents of this community are given a choice. And I think that the current ballot initiative is a good idea for the city to put forward. The El Pueblo Viejo was limited just by the nature of the requirements that they had to put forward. It had to be very draconian in nature. I think that this ordinance that's being proposed is a reasonable alternative, and should the citizens of this community decide that a ballot reduction measure is the right thing to do, we think that this one certainly addresses the important community benefit aspects that need to be considered. Lastly, I think that we all need to look at this economy, and we need to look at the impact of the world events, the national events are having on our community. And I think in a financial crisis of epic proportions, as everyone is saying, and uncharted territory, the last thing we need to be doing is further reducing the ability of Santa Barbara to plan for its future. Santa Barbara made national and international news by being very progressive as setting a standard for an energy reduction ordinance that was just very progressive. I want to applaud this council and many of you for leading that charge. I think it would be a regressive approach to be able to look at reducing the downtown carrying capacity of this community forever, because that would send the wrong message and I think head us the wrong direction. So we support this alternative measure. We encourage you guys to pursue it, and we specifically support the recommendations from the Santa Barbara For All that have been summarized and stated. Thank you.
Connie Hanna, followed by Kathy McCammon.
I'm Connie Hanna, speaking for the League of Women Voters. Last week, the League statement said that we opposed the supplemental initiative because it had all the same problems that the previous alternative initiative had. Now that you're planning to go back to the alternative initiative, we're going to continue to oppose that. The exceptions that this alternative would provide are simply too broad. In any future city council could approve almost anything as a community priority. Almost any amount of rental or affordable housing might be qualified if exact amounts are not specified. The city's experience shows that almost no new rentals are being proposed by anybody, and any additional requirements that you might add would make them totally impossible to build. There are far too many unanswered questions involved in adopting this alternative. The League will continue to oppose putting it on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy McCammon, followed by Brian Kernall.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy McCammon, and I'm here for Allied Neighborhood Associations and the Save El Pueblo Viejo Committee. We oppose both the supplemental and alternative ballot measures. It is incumbent on you to not further muddy the waters and to trust the people of Santa Barbara. Let them have a simple choice. Give them the right to vote no if they support the current 60-foot height limit, or give them the choice to vote yes if they support lower height limits, 40 feet for the El Pueblo Historic District and 45 feet for the rest of the commercial area. We think it is important that the city not further contribute to what is the distrust of government. And like I said, give the people a simple choice. Let them vote yes or no. Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Oh, sorry. It's good, us.
My name is Brian Kernall. I agree with all of the previous speakers, except the last two.
Brian, before you say anything more, I just want to make sure that Mickey knows we haven't forgotten about her and she's last.
I think the comments on the sustainable community aspects are really the important reason we're here with this alternative. This is about making sure that we do have flexibility in the future. As Joe mentioned, I think the really key thing here is that we have it built into this, that it's clear we're creating incentives for the things this community needs in order to make it sustainable in the future. And that is affordable housing, and that is our community priorities. So specifically talking to some of these points that Steve was, and I'm just anticipating the campaign that's going to be coming forward, in this language that's up here, I'm a little concerned, and this may be nitpicking, but I want to think about it, because I think one of the key political debates that will come out is that, well, council can approve anything under this community priority plan, that is just wide open. And in some ways, this initial language, the part that's outlined here, where it says, notwithstanding, city council may establish by ordinance a special use permit process, that kind of just feels like it's somehow creating this broad exception, when in fact the language of the community priority is very, very clear. And I don't know if we can flip that language to start with the community priority aspect, but it's very important for the community to know when they're making this choice that it's about affordable housing and it's about nonprofit community priorities that we're creating this exception for. So I wanted to make that point. And then as far as process, I understand, particularly in light of Steve's comments about how at the end you don't want to take away a designation, so the final approval or the final community priority designation by council would be almost automatic. That is why the first step was this community design review or the conceptual design review. I just want to make sure that projects don't get bogged down in what is and has become a fairly political process, particularly at the HLC, and before it even gets to council. I think somehow there needs to be a mechanism whereby it's clear to an applicant, yes, you qualify as a community priority or as an affordable housing project, and that there is there's only enough review before it goes to council to get a general, so that council can get a general understanding of what's being proposed, that projects don't get bogged down in that process, that they're allowed to get the designation early, and then you get into the details, obviously, Planning Commission. And I would suggest that, in fact, if it is one of these community priority projects in the downtown, it may well be a project that should go to the Planning Commission conceptually before it would go to design review, because it's going to be dealing with bigger, potentially larger planning issues. So those are my comments. I also want to echo, and I mentioned this to you before, the whole issue of height. I think that 40 feet is a very real problem architecturally, and we need to create that flexibility. I know that there are prominent members of the El Pueblo Viejo group that are in agreement with the notion of changing the definition of height. I think the important thing here, though, is that the community understand clearly up front that it's going to be done, so that it doesn't feel like it's a bait and switch situation. Thank you.
We'll end things with Mickey Flax.
Don't start the clock yet. I have seen you guys on Halloween with funny hats, all kinds of things. Today is Purim, which is a Jewish holiday, totally secular. We're not breaching any walls here. And part of the tradition of Purim, and this is not a bribe, you can report it, is the giving of food gifts, particularly what are called Hamantaschen, which are cookies filled with a poppy seed jam kind of filling that are supposed to resemble the pocket of Haman, who was the bad guy. And of course, Jewish holidays always have one theme. They tried to kill us. They didn't. Let's eat. So here it is for you. It's in the tradition of Purim.
Thank you, Mickey. I don't think we have to report it unless it's worth more than $55.
It's equal time for Halloween. And the costumes, by the way, on Purim and all kinds of stuff. Very similar holiday.
Okay, I'll give you the 2 minutes.
I want to thank Steve Wiley for what I think is an excellent draft of both the alternative and of the companion ordinance. One typo I found, and quoting the community priority, the city charter section 1508, it should be on page 2, top of page 2, a project which is found by the city council to meet present or projected needs rather than project needs. One thing that's missing, I think, is the notion, and maybe it needs a separate section, is the notion of rebuilding a historical landmark such as the Arlington, which exceeds even 60 feet. Now, I'm not sure what the present 60-foot limit would do to rebuilding the Arlington, but maybe now is the time to say that if there is such a building that needs to be rebuilt, all bets are off, and that it should be rebuilt to the same, as much as possible, to the same construction as existed before. In terms of the process and the order of it, I would suggest that the City Council is the appropriate place first to decide whether indeed a community priority standards are being met by the proposed project. I think there has to be that kind of preliminary review by the City Council just on the basis of what the purpose of the project is. Then it can go for conceptual design and also obviously to the Planning Commission. The language says upon obtaining the required conceptual design review. That's different from design approval. So I guess it's possible for the HLC and the ABR to say, we hate this project, but then it still comes to the City Council. But I don't know the way it's written. I think the City Council should make the designation of whether or not it is a community priority before anything else. In terms of the exemplary architecture requirement, I would much prefer to see a requirement for LEED standards, either gold or platinum. And exemplary architecture is very much in the eye of the beholder. And also there are some community projects like Cottage Hospital, for instance, where architecture is not the primary concern. The primary concern is function. And sometimes they're not ugly, but they're not necessarily exemplary. So I think that's opening a Pandora's box to try to talk about exemplary architecture. In terms of whether we need essentially incentives for market rate or upper middle income projects, I think we do. All of the condos that are not being sold today are being rented at very high rates, meaning that there is a need for this kind of housing, of rental housing for upper middle income folks. Doesn't take too much for two people who have decent but not great jobs can very quickly go into the upper middle category, and they need housing. And as a matter of fact, in this market, they prefer rental housing rather than still being forced to buy $1 million condos. So I think that the affordable housing section of the city should be changed to include what we call upper middle housing. And finally, the definition of building height, yes, indeed needs to be revised, as has been discussed here, including allowing for flood zones, for topography of the site, and so on. And this, as Brian said, should be done before this ordinance goes on the books. And in terms of the charter amendment itself, I agree that to allow buildings up to an additional 15 feet is a better way of putting it. But other than that, again, I want to thank Mr. Wiley and this committee for doing, and the staff for doing an excellent job in getting before the voters an opportunity to see what this kind of restriction would do and would not do, to allow the voters to affirmatively say, yes, we want lower buildings, but yes, we want to be able to rebuild, we want community benefits, and we want affordable housing. That's invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mickey. Does staff have any comments on the suggestions that have been made before we go to the committee members? Seeing none, I'll just open it up for the committee members. Any comments? Mr. House.
I wanted to allow our other colleague to chime in there. I want to be respectful and not just always jump right in. So
It's okay. Jump away.
Okay, so I believe that our task is given to us by City Councils to do the very best job we can to come up with an alternative for the ballot, and whether or not when it gets back to Council there's enough support to be able to do that, we should do our very best that we can right here. And I think what's been revealed in the process is that it is not a simple matter, this whole thing. It is complex, and there's an awful lot to it. So I appreciate the staff for having come back and answered so many of our questions and given us some really good language here to work with. I'll just cut to the chase on some of these things. On the proposed alternative charter amendment that we had that is up there on the screen, I would recommend that we unless there's a strong objection or I mean a legal reason why not, that we revise the language of that first sentence in the second underlined section to read, to allow buildings of up to an additional 15 feet in height, and then go on within.
I agree.
And Mr. Wiley, was there any problem with that in particular, or would that be okay?
No, Mr. Chair, I think everyone, Mr. House, I think everyone understands that that would then result in a maximum height limitation within EPV of 15 feet and outside
55.
of EPV of 60 feet. So that's actually a bit more flexibility and
Okay.
sort of moves more towards the EPV position. So
We all jumped in and corrected you because you said a maximum height of 15 feet, which would be a very interesting structure, especially with a sloped roof. And
It's a Hobbit structure.
55 feet.
okay.
So,
All right.
no, that's a good idea.
Great, thank you, sir. And then there was a comment about the same paragraph a few moments ago, and I recognize the dilemma in crafting this language. I think that the way that it's organized, the notwithstanding portion coming first, and then the rationale for which we would go ahead, that we would move forward in this coming second, it almost puts the rationale as subordinate to the measure that the City Council may take, and not necessarily for right now, but would you be willing to look at that prior to coming back to Council to see if there's a way to emphasize the community priority side of this and the reason for, get that up front, because the way it is right now, it really does lend itself towards as if it's just it's kind of a loose thing, and it really isn't. The process that's being established here is really rigorous and very deliberative, and I don't know that this language allows us to feel that. And that has to do with just that subordinate clause that starts at notwithstanding the above, the City Council may establish, and then it goes on with the rationale. It's difficult, but
Yeah, it's tough.
it's tough, I know.
I always understood good sentence structures gets to the subject and the verb pretty quick.
Right.
And what
Yeah.
I'm hearing is, let's get community priority in there real quick. But what about affordable housing? Well, we got to get that in there quick
Yeah.
too. So I think it can be done in order to see buildings.
Well, it should be clear as day. It just should be crystal clear, and I think that's our goal. This is pretty good, but if there's any way that could be improved.
Yeah.
I just had a couple of other things. I do agree that the building height, if there is going to be some sort of a redefinition of what we mean by that's something we should get to as soon as we possibly can. But I think the language we have in here pointing in that direction is helpful. There was a question about community priority designation, and that somehow that would be preceded by design review. And I can understand the sensitivity to the whole issue, but it seems to me that determination right up front, whether or not this is a community this is something that could be considered community priority, is a critical thing. And then design review boards and all the rest will be working within that context. I would really hate to put ABR and HLC in a position of having to try to second guess or ahead of time pre-guess what council might consider a community priority. I think that needs to be up front, the City Council first. So I don't know if others would agree, but I believe that that's the way the process should go. See if there's a couple others. Oh, yes, and I'd raised some issues, raised the question about the Okay, on ownership projects, this is item number 5 on our list of recommendations. Ownership projects, 30% affordable to middle income or lesser. The way we've been going after this in the city has been to go to upper middle income, and that goes up to 160 to 200%. There is a need for that. I'd like to hear from at least one other colleague on the council about that before we make our mind up as a team here. And then on the rental units, I believe that just rental units is enough. We don't need to go to the 30% affordable. I recognize from Mr. Faustich's comments that rentals by their very nature would be a plus if we could have some incentive for those.
My suggestion on how we handle the definitions of affordability is to reference the city's affordability guidelines and just leave it at that. That's simple, and that allows that if there is a necessity in the future for middle-income rental, then we can create that category. Right now, it would not apply to that. But if in the future we created price-controlled middle-income rentals, then we would have the flexibility to grant the additional height for that if in the future that was necessary. But to me, opening it up for all market rental units, especially downtown, because of the premium on the downtown housing, doesn't meet the kind of the spirit of what we're trying to do here. I think downtown rentals sometimes are used for vacation homes or for folks of upper incomes to have a townhome downtown. And so I don't think opening it up to any kind of rental really meets the spirit of what we're trying to do. So my suggestion, and please, I'd love some staff feedback if this is feasible, is for us to reference for both affordable and rental units the city's affordability guidelines and allow the future generations the flexibility that there might be the need for an additional affordability definition that we don't have right now.
And,
I think staff supported that.
Did you understand a word I said?
I think.
Sorry, I didn't follow.
Sorry.
I think that is staff's general position and why Mr. Wiley's draft language does reference the Affordable Handbook. Just again for a clarification, Chair Williams, then you're saying in the event that the city would have a provision for rental projects, you are interested in at least 30% meeting the rental guidelines?
Right.
Okay.
And for
so
right
as
now,
Mr.
Right
more or
now,
less as Mr. Falstich.
For low-income folks, for rentals, or
right.
for middle-income folks for ownership. But in the future, if there was an affordability criteria for middle income, it would be able to encompass that definition.
I guess what I don't follow, there is an affordability program for middle income. We've got middle income restricted units, right? So
that's not what I understood from Mr. Falstich.
Not for apartments. But
not for rental.
Not for rentals.
Oh, okay.
That's the purpose.
So what you're suggesting is the apartments be restricted to low income?
Yes, but the definitions say, reference the city's affordability guidelines so that if in the future there was a middle income category for rentals, that would be able to be used. Right now, that's not needed under our market conditions, but it's difficult to predict market conditions into the future.
I just have to, language like that really wouldn't mean anything. I think it would just be confusing. It's like, and if something happens in the future, you just don't put that in an ordinance, particularly not one that's going to go to the voters. What does that mean? I mean, if we want to make the apartments only available to lower income, 30% of them available to low income household, that's fine, that's clear enough. But to talk about some change in the future, I don't even know how to draft that.
Mr. Chair, we're talking now about the implementing ordinance,
Yes.
not the charter amendment.
I
so
believe
the implementing
you don't
ordinance,
want to complicate the charter amendment.
Right.
Yeah.
The implementing ordinance is something that could come back if there were to be a change to be amended at city council level.
That's right.
And I think that meets your flexibility interest. And so if I understand, you're saying the 30% would be at the low income level that Mr. Faustus talked about, but the rest, the 70% of any rental would be just at market rate.
Right.
Okay, I can go with that.
And the purpose is I don't want rentals just to be market rate, because in the downtown, if has a decently large unit size, it might not be used, for workforce folks.
Right, and but it also may make the project affordable to construct. I mean, if you just restrict them all down to the low, then we may not have a project that can actually be feasible. I'll just conclude my remarks in saying I agree with the speakers who said that they were disappointed that this wasn't taking place in the context of the Plan Santa Barbara process. I've said that over and again. My issues with all of this have been truly process-oriented. The issue is that the request of City Council early on to somehow take this on and jump ahead of the Plan Santa Barbara process, I disagreed with that. We promised the voters, we promised the community a substantive and real honest opportunity to participate in Plan Santa Barbara. I wouldn't want to take that away, and I'm sad that we have something on the ballot being proposed as an initiative, but that's out of my hands. I think this should be at the Plan Santa Barbara level. So if what we've done here is really good homework, were that to come around, if it turned out that this could get back into Plan Santa Barbara, all the work that we've done so far will really be helpful. But my goal at this point is to at least get something in front of the voters that would be an alternative that really does the enrichment side of it that you couldn't possibly do with just a simple petition-sponsored initiative. And then I guess the last thing on that is that I wish that we had this kind of crafting would be so much better if we had participation from different points of view. I mean, you've got Das and me here working on this, and people here from the public who have come and presented to us. But it's not the same as us really trying to craft some sort of a middle ground thing. It's very, very hard to do it from just one perspective. And I've tried very hard, and I think you have as well, Mr. Williams, to include all different points of view in this conversation so that we have something that's balanced to present to the voters. So we'll see how City Council, whether there's support at the council level for this or not, but thanks to everyone for participating.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, as everyone knows, I think this exercise is a diversion, and that's why I've not participated in the details of crafting it. But I just wanted to point one thing out. There may be enough votes on council to put this on the ballot, or not. But as this is structured, whether it goes on the ballot or not, and if it does go on the ballot, if it passes, it requires 5 votes of council to actually create the mechanism whereby a 60-foot building would be allowed. So by going this route, what you're saying is it will require a supermajority of council to get what you want.
Mr. Chair, if maybe I could make sure we're all on the same page here, because I agree with that point, but the point is that this ordinance ultimately this implementing ordinance, whether it's adopted by the council prior to the election and says it won't become effective unless and until this alternative amendment is approved by more affirmative votes than the SAVE EPV, or it's perhaps introduced prior to the election but not adopted until after the election, ultimately the adoption of this ordinance will require 5 votes. We're not presuming anything at this point of staff. It's the 5-vote requirement's been in the charter since 1980, Charter Section 1507. So, yeah.
I think that's a good point, and I think it says something about the fact that we really have heard what the public's saying is that they do want to have some higher hurdles here for some of these projects. And, I think what people have asked is, why not just have a yes or no vote? And the reason is because these are not just yes or no questions. I try to do a lot of research onto what the people of Santa Barbara feel, because I think it's good to do due diligence as their representative. And from the information that I have gathered through polling, 50-something%, maybe a low 50%, support some limitation on building heights. But 60-something% consider building more affordable and workforce housing a large community priority. And 70-something% want us to protect all of our remaining open space. So, to me, to really do good service to the community requires doing more than just addressing the building heights question in isolation. It means dealing with the building heights question in conjunction with affordable and workforce housing, and really the need to not create a demand, more market demand, on building on our open space. I think that this alternative is a good route to doing that. Some might view those desires, meaning for less auspicious buildings and for more affordable housing and for keeping all our open space, as contrary desires. But I think if we hammer out a good policy, that those do not need to be contrary. And that's what we're attempting to do here. And we've been beat up a lot for trying to create a compromise. But I think it's the only way to bring together some very different priorities that the majority of the community has. I'm only going to do one bit of wordsmithing on top of what Mr. House added, which is on page 3 of the implementing ordinance, big C, little c, appropriate setbacks in open space. The project will provide an appropriate front yard setback. And I think what we should say, which is at least an average of 5-foot variable in that parentheses. Because that gets at exactly the question that we've heard at hearings over and over, that this 5-foot setback, 5-foot variable setback is something that's almost universally desired. Can we make that change?
Well, Mr. Chair, I think I need to ask Ms. Weiss if she feels that the concept of variability is sufficiently black and white that we can just use the word and it'll be sort of self-implementing.
There are other communities that have made standard use of the variable setback, and we're in the process of developing an ordinance where I think people will be able to find its definition within our code shortly. So I'm comfortable with that concept.
So we would use it and presume we're going to define it.
Yes, that would be fine.
Mr. Chair, I
So
just want
it's
to
an
comment.
average
But
of
my
5
question
feet.
is
Yeah, it's an average of 5 feet.
that the chair said add more detail to that finding saying at least 5 foot. So that's a question to me is...
Yeah, if someone has more than a 5-foot variable setback, we're not going to penalize them for that, right?
Okay.
And Mr. Chair, what about, this is where you really start working this, you get into the details. What about on State Street? What about half a block off of State Street? All in the EPV, it would be inappropriate to be requiring 5-foot variable setbacks in both of those areas. So it seems to me like this needs to point in the direction, and then we're going to have to come forward with some clarity afterwards. But I would really hate to make those kinds of requirements, where it would be counterproductive to a vital, viable downtown environment.
You've convinced me. That's fine.
Yes,
we'll wait
staff will work with the city attorney on a number of comments and edits to this draft as it moves forward to the council, and it'll be for the council's discussion as well.
Okay. Have you heard sufficient unanimity, or not unanimity, but sufficient votes behind Mr. House's suggestions to the changes to the charter amendment?
I still had a question about whether we're going to require conceptual design review before going to council for preliminary designation. And I'll just volunteer again, in my experience, as a personal view, the council's going to have a hard time with preliminary designations without some sort of design having been looked at by some city body at that point. And for those members, those architects who suggested otherwise, I believe they're mistaken. I could see the council having a real hard time saying, oh, I'd rather refer this to ABR first and for input. The council likes design input.
What's our current practice?
Well,
Yeah. On community priority now for Measure E allocations, concept review by the Design Review Board is not a requirement. Some projects do like to go and have some conceptual review, but we only allow 1 or 2 conceptual reviews because they don't have the Measure E allocation. So we really don't process people very far along, but some projects do like to have that. You will see a project in a few weeks. It's the Children's Museum. It's in El Pueblo Viejo, and it's on State Street, and it's coming to you first for, I think, 2,000 some odd square feet, and it hasn't been to the HLC yet. And so we feel that for the community priority determination for a children's museum in 2,000 square feet, that design review concept wasn't an absolute requirement. Now it's really at the discretion of the staff and the applicant to craft the process, should you go to HLC first. But I can tell you that we've been very strict tracking Measure E square footage, and so people do not get very far in the process until we know where their square footage is coming from. That's now. This is really a different program. I mean, it's similar, but it's different. So I think you need to consider what you think works for this call, this determination about building height and priority land use, housing, but it's still building height too. So that's why staff supported the idea of having a concept review, which I believe would be limited. We're not going to be spending a lot of time at design review boards if council hasn't made a preliminary determination. I think it could be 1 or 2 meetings at the most of design review.
Mr. Chair, Betty's using the word review, not approval.
right, and that was
That's what the ordinance says too.
in the ordinance.
Yeah, review.
I think that's fine.
Okay, I go with that. Let's make a motion then to move this with the recommended revisions to City Council for consideration.
Second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Mr. Chair, I just want to, because I know that this may not be clear to some people, I think the schedule is to have this at the City Council on March 24th. Well, let's be clear about what that hearing's about. That is only, and correct me if you see it differently, Betty, that is only to declare this ordinance a project for the purposes of environmental review. You know, CEQA says you don't do environmental review too early when something is vague, you don't really know what you're reviewing, and you don't do it too late when it's really, after the fact, fait accompli. So we feel March 24th, this draft having been sort of really pretty well hammered out by the Ordinance Committee, is appropriate to declare it a project for the purposes of environmental review, and then we'll do that. But this ordinance is not going to even be suggested for possible introduction until we act on the election in June.
Okay. Thank you.
Can we adjourn?
Yeah, we're adjourned. Council will start in 10 minutes.